Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Austin Young Chamber's Civics 201 Issues and Policy in Central Texas for the pre-learning session, Affordable to Exorbitant, How Affordability Has Shifted Over the Last 35 Years. My name is Mel Martin, and I'm the Director of Membership and Engagement for the Austin Young Chamber. At the Austin Young Chamber, we are focused on supporting young professionals to be the dynamic business and community leaders our region needs. Among our focus is to create a young professional community that fosters diversity of ideas and perspectives so that we can collectively overcome the many challenges we are facing as a community. We run many programs throughout the year that promote talent development, entrepreneurship, and community growth. Since the pandemic started affecting our community in March, the Austin Young Chamber has continued to offer programming virtually, over 30 programs in the past 6 months. We encourage you to hop on our website at austinyc.org to learn more about becoming a member and engaging with us throughout the year. And now, on to our session. We know rising costs are making it difficult for many Austinites to find affordable housing, stay in Austin city limits, and balance our budget. In this crash course, you will hear a brief history on affordability issues in our region and its effects on those it is meant to help. It is my pleasure to welcome our speaker, Kendra Garrett. Kendra provides leadership for the Austin Justice Coalition's Complete Communities initiatives and is part of the AISD focus team. Leaving corporate America after a decade, Kendra knew she wanted to be of use in her community. Inspired by and standing on the shoulders of her fellow community organizers and activists, past and present, she strives to build trust starting at the block level and to help people realize they have more power than they believe they have. She believes collectively we can have an equitable, just society that values all people equally. Kendra works for Betco Housing Lab as a development consultant. Her experience in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors has sharpened her policy and research skills to determine the best ways to create accessible and thriving communities with a housing-first focus. She holds a Bachelor's of Science in Chemical Engineering from the University of Texas at Austin and a Master's degree in Public Affairs from the University of Texas's Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. Kendra, thank you for joining us today, and I'll now virtually pass the mic to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mel. And thank you so much, Austin Young Chamber, for allowing me the opportunity to come present on Affordability 101. Again, my name is Kendra Garrett, and thank you for having me. So I'm going to kind of present to you about the basics of what does affordability mean, and what does it mean in the context of Austin. So we're going to, for our agenda today, we'll go a very brief history of affordability, and then we'll talk about, is Austin affordable, and what does that mean in terms of federal guidelines and how that's implemented at the local level. And then we'll talk about federal housing programs and how that there are programs that are aimed to kind of help with housing affordability. And I'm going to kind of step back for a little bit. The purpose, so this presentation is kind of centered on housing affordability, particularly because a rent or mortgage is typically a household or family's largest living expense. And so whenever we're talking about affordability, it kind of starts at that level, and then other constraints are kind of added onto that. And we'll touch a little bit on that as well during this presentation. So I do want to say that this presentation, the baseline of affordability is around housing. And then there's other things that kind of tinker around with that. That's kind of when we talk about affordability at the local level, we mean it kind of at the housing level, and then what other constraints are creating it to be an unaffordable city for folks to be able to live inside the city limits. So kind of continue with the agenda. But then we'll talk about local programs that are going to helping with precisely that. What are ways that we're doing it from the resident-centered side versus like the residential development side, programs that Austin is trying, and then where do we go from here? How can we how can we change policy or programmatic level or programs that would help make Austin a much more affordable city? So a very brief history of affordability. So kind of post the Great Depression and World War II, and so getting the economy back on its feet, the intent of reducing poverty and ensuring Americans had a place to sleep at night. the federal government went into overdrive with policy and programmatic changes to be able to provide housing. And so one of those, kind of in addition to the massive home scale that you saw across the nation, think Levittown, the federal government passed the 1937 National Housing Act. And so within this act, it created the Public Housing Program, or PHAs. And so it allowed for folks at the very low income scale to be able to have a safe, decent place to sleep at night across the country. And so Austin was one of those original cities that had one of the first housing developments established across the nation. And so, but when you're talking about affordability, during that time, income limits were instead of maximum rents were kind of established for family eligibility for people to live. So that means that a tenant income could not exceed 5 or 6 times the amount of rent. However, over the next 3 decades, as more PHAs were popping up and they were struggling to kind of contain the rising costs for operations and maintenance, their revenue stream was just not keeping up with their expenses. So by 1968, 69-ish, escalating rents by public PHAs were struggling. And so they wanted a better way to increase the revenue stream. And so a solution to that was the Brooke Amendment that was established in the 1968 Housing Act, which allowed for income to be used instead of monthly rent. And so now it's based on a different criteria, median family income. And so some dude during these deliberations figured out that was to set it at 25. It was kind of an arbitrary amount, but now it's been set as since it's been included in all of our housing programs since the 70s or the late 60s, it's now the benchmark that we use for what we deem to be affordability. So it started at 25%, and by the 1980s, it became 30%. So now the established benchmark is 30% of income is how much you should be spending on housing, rent, or mortgage. And now we've actually included utilities in that mix. So when we say affordability, we base it based on the U.S. Department Housing and Urban Development definition, which a household that spends 30% or less of their income on rent/mortgage and utilities. And so within that, we also have a couple other definitions that talk about affordability. And so one of them is cost burden. So a household that spends more than 30% of their income on rent plus utilities is considered cost burden. And then someone who spends more than 50% of their income on rent plus utilities is considered severely cost burden. And so a couple of stats on the right-hand side. For Texas, roughly 30% are cost burden and 13% are extremely cost burden, right? But then if you look at Austin, which is higher than the state of Texas, 36% are considered cost burden and 17% are considered extremely cost burden. And so we kind of talked about MFI briefly, but to better explain it, so it's MFI is the stat that's used for pretty much most housing programs that provide assistance or subsidy for development of affordable housing programs. And so they are based on kind of a Travis County, Round Rock MSA area, and it does set the affordability limits. And so when we're talking about affordable housing programs and where that income limit falls, it's in the range of 30 to 80% MFI range. And so for 2020, the Austin MSA MFI for a family of 4 at 100% is $97,600. And so when you're thinking about affordable housing programs, the max amount at 80% MFI is $78,100, which is actually quite high if you think about the types of jobs that pay that amount on an annual basis. And so, but the problem with MFI, right? So it includes the entire kind of Austin MSA area, but it also includes your high earners and your sub areas. So when we think about how folks that are impacted and don't make high numbers, and so housing is unaffordable, and you have a higher cost burden or extremely cost burden households. Our wages, there's the differential between our wages keeping up with actual incomes. for working class families. And so that's where we're seeing a lot of the unaffordability here in Austin. And so kind of a snapshot of what that looks like. This is all based on 2019 data. But so back then, last year, it was 95,900 was the median income. And so within 1 year, right, it's moved up to roughly $2,000, which is a lot on a city scale, considering that I would definitely bet that most folks looking at this, their income maybe not had gone up that much in within a year time frame. Particularly for your working class folks, that would be your teachers, your service providers, your caretakers, people who work in retail or in the service industry or the entertainment industry as well. Like thinking about what working class looks like, they're not seeing that sort of growth in their income. And so it's making it much more harder for folks to be able to afford to live within the city limits. And so that kind of goes to like the average monthly rent is $1,350. And then your average home price is over $400,000, which is incredibly expensive. So when you're thinking about where people can live, we have a deficit of housing affordability for folks at the very bottom, right? So within your poverty range, so 0 to 30% MFI. And we definitely have an unaffordability for folks that are kind of at your moderate income, so 80 to 120% MFI. Because even though it's like someone who's making, let's say, at 80%, $78,000, still going to be really hard to afford a $400,000 home. And so as there's no starter home, so you have to see a lot of folks that are kind of in this 80%, 100% MFI still renting because there is no housing stock that's accommodating for them. And so you have a squeezing from both sides within the housing market that's continuing creating the unaffordability, in addition to not enough units that are keeping up with population increases on a year-to-year basis. And so things that have kind of contributed to Austin's unaffordability. So kind of a little historical context. Redlining is one of those that has redlining and exclusionary zoning. We're going to kind of tie those two together. So when Austin was established, the master plan in 1928, they essentially displaced and forcibly moved Black and Brown folks from parts of the city to the east side, right? And so that essentially cut off half the city for folks to be able to live, and created subpar parts of the region of the city that was not invested at the city level or the state level, and contributed to kind of high poverty. And so, but as you have growth over decades, you have a lot more investment in one part of the city and less in the other one. And so by the time we got to the 90s, the 80s and the 90s, they realized that we need to do like a smart growth plan and start trying to invest in these areas. However, the areas of town, i.e. West Austin, continued to have rising because you couldn't build and people couldn't live in certain parts of the city. It becomes exclusionary zoning such that housing prices are outside the income limits of some folks that are that couldn't live there, or racist practices between real estate and private market also contributed to that sort of unaffordability. And then, but back on the east side, once the city of Austin decided that East Austin would become a pro-growth sort of thing, you started having a lot of displacement and a lot of gentrification starting to occur in the east side that are now moving all your previously displaced people of color, communities of color, from East Austin now to the outskirts, to Maynard, to Pflugerville, to Round Rock, and then to Hayes-Town in the bottom, that are creating, so they're not really investing in it, but now it seems like you have land speculation, and people are now interested in this area because West Austin is now really expensive. And so now everybody's moving to the east side, making now property taxes go up, and land prices increase. So folks who it was affordable at the time no longer is able to afford it and have to move out. And so that's definitely contributed to housing unaffordability. And then we kind of move into, let's say, the Great Recession in 2008, where you had Austin didn't really experience the sort of housing bust that occurred in different parts of the country. However, housing building changed, right? So now it was a little bit more built houses that were built for higher income residents versus kind of your starter home, and also affordable housing was stagnant for quite some time. And so we are still playing catch up in terms of how much units are built on a year-to-year basis. And then another thing that contributes to Austin's unaffordability is zoning. And that's kind of a mix of opinions in terms of how much zoning should contribute to being unaffordable. Like, should we get rid of single family zoning? Like, in order to create neighborhoods that are mixed income and mixed housing types and mix between residential and commercial to be able to have folks be able to work and live and play closer to their house. What does that look like on a zoning space? And also looking at that from a landscape of the citywide landscape. And then also what does that mean in terms of like environmental concerns and how you want to lay it out. And also, where do you put industry and manufacturing plants as well? And so, like, zoning could be over restrictive that prevents some housing being built, and then sometimes it's in place to ensure that people aren't living next to waste disposal that creates a lot of health effects, right? And so in some ways zoning works really well, and sometimes it could work against trying to make a more affordable city. But those are still conversations being had over the next several years as we continue having discussions around our land development code and how to create a much more affordable city by increasing the number of housing that's developed, and also housing types, in the age of climate change and in the age of just really making a much more connected, walkable city, and what that means in terms of sustainability terms. And so additional constraints to affordability are kind of things that just happen on your like individual or life expense. So low wages. Like minimum wage hasn't an increase since 2010 and it's $7.25. Like that is not a living wage for folks to be able to live anywhere. Maybe very rural America or something. But even in rural America, it's actually starting to see its own housing crisis, not as much as say Austin or urban areas, but it's definitely having it's starting to see some housing crisis as well. And so low wages and it just not keeping up with inflation and in keeping up with what actually is deemed to be affordable in a city is one definite reason for constraints on affordability. Additional ones are debt. Like we are a country and a society that has a lot of debt than previous generations. So student loan debt, healthcare, how much it costs for childcare. All these things kind of play into when you think about 30% of my income can't be more for housing and utilities, then you have a whole another percentage of your income that goes towards debt, right? Or and then also utility and transportation costs. So how much it costs to maintain a car or to take public transit to get to your work. And if you don't live in a part of the city that's close to your job, that you make that up in time and money. Either it takes a long time to get from your house via car or bus or train if you live in other parts of the city, or parts of other cities around this nation, and gas and maintenance, and then time it takes in round trip. And so all these things contribute to what is deemed that creates the unaffordable city that we have. And so ways that on the government side that has been trying to kind of help with affordability problems is on the federal level, we'll kind of start there. So back to 1937, public housing authorities. In Austin, we have 18. I believe HACA owns, the Housing Authority for City of Austin owns 18 PHAs sites. And then Travis County also has its own PHA. And so those housing is for your kind of pretty low income folks, from anywhere from 0 to 35% MFI is within public housing authorities. In addition to, so those are just actual developments with units that folks live in. In addition to that, there's two other types of programs, and they're tenant-based or project-based rental assistance, or what is termed as like Section 8 or housing vouchers. And so there's two separate ones. So tenant-based rental assistance are subsidized housing vouchers that allow for folks to be able to choose and lease privately owned rental vouchers. They can, as long as the landlord will take them, they're able to live there anywhere in the city, right? And then there's project-based ones that are fairly subsidized rental units. So let's say you have a rental development and you have 20 units in that rental development. All 20 could be subsidized on a contract that the owner either has directly with HUD or with a local PHA that allows for those units to be subsidized at some percentage of rent for your residents, and that maintains the affordability for a much longer term, and those contracts are renewed on an annual basis. The next program, which is actually the biggest program that creates affordable housing nationwide, is the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program. It started in 1986 in the Reagan era. It was intended to be kind of a public-private partnership sort of program. And so it is federally funded through the IRS, but it's managed on the state level. And there's two types of programs. There's a 4%, which is kind of a non-competitive one that's laced with bonds, private activity bonds. And then there's one that's 9%, a straight tax credit, and it's a much more competitive process. And so the purpose of this program is essentially to subsidize the development or the construction of affordable housing. And in return, those units remain affordable for at least 30 years. And so that's the program that's funded over 10 years and creates the most amount of affordable housing statewide. And so how we kind of use it in Austin is that also like we can lace local bond money, which we'll kind of talk about later in follow-up slides, to kind of maximize the ability to increase the number of affordable housing units that are built within Austin. And then other programs that contribute to like helping to finance the construction of affordable housing is home investment partnerships, rental assistance demonstration, which helps PHAs rehab their units to be better housing for folks. You can use community development block grant funding, and you can also use National Housing Trust Fund ones. Didn't really go a little bit in those, but there's just a few other programs that also provide financing to help with affordable housing programs. And so on the local level, we're going to do it in kind of two parts. The first one is kind of resident-centered programs. So the city provides provides the opportunity for folks to own homes at 80% or below. And case in point, a good example of that is Mueller, right? That was a kind of a public-private partnership on land that was able to provide ability for folks whose incomes are less than 80% MFI to own a home and kind of start that kind of building of intergenerational wealth. And so we have a couple of those across in different parts of the city. And we also have other like nonprofits like Habitat or in other nonprofits or organizations who also provide ownership opportunities for folks that are kind of your low to moderate income. In addition to that, the city has a home repair program that helps folks repair their homes. A huge strategy for combating unaffordability, but also allowing folks to stay in their homes is home repair, because sometimes the reason people end up getting displaced or having to move is like high property taxes, but also if you're able to pay that, you may not be able to pay like if a tree falls on your house, or like you need extensive plumbing, like all these things like that. Utilizing city money to help with that tremendously helps people stay in their homes, and be able to create this, like money has to kind of come from somewhere in order to kind of help maintain that affordability for a person. In addition, we have utility assistance programs through Austin Water and Austin Electric. So we have customer assistance programs to help with folks at different income levels afford utilities. And then recently, we do also have mortgage and rental assistance. It hasn't been extensively used like it has during COVID, during this time. It's kind of ad hoc, and it comes out of our National Housing Trust Fund, our local housing trust fund dollars. But now during COVID, we've seen with the rent program and the RISE program, some of that money has come from our general fund, and some of it's come from the federal government through the CARES Act. But essentially, we've been infusing a lot of rent assistance and just general assistance into local economy to ensure that folks don't become homeless, and really striving to help folks during this like really hard time with so much economic instability and the world that we currently live in. So like prior to COVID, rental assistance has been utilized on an ad hoc basis. Right now, it's being super infused into our local economy, and so it's kind of determined what that will like kind of look like post COVID, and if we as a city can establish a kind of a ongoing rent assistance program that kind of helps, or increase the amount of like supportive housing, that would also help in terms of affordability, particularly in that range that we kind of talked about earlier, about 0 to 30%, in order to help folks, lower income folks, be able to live within the city that they work in, right? So then part two of the housing programs are kind of residential development center programs. And so a lot of this money comes from the general revenue fund for the city, but also the general obligation bonds that are voter approved. So in the last one was $250 million that was passed, I believe, in 2017. And so there's programs, there's rental assistance, rental housing development assistance program, RHODA, which supports the development of affordable rental housing for low to moderate income. And then there's the ownership side. So developers also can work with the city that helps finance the construction for affordable ownership units that are low to moderate income. And so what you'll end up sometimes having is that a developer wants to develop 100 units, and some of the funding comes from maybe from LIHTC. Some of it also may come from the RHODA program, which together would help fully fund the construction, and maybe even a private loan, the construction of affordable housing, so that it's less debt is carried on the developer side in order for units to be affordable, maintain at an affordable level for residents at different income levels. That makes sense. The next one is land acquisition. So part of this $250 million bond, $100 million was used for land acquisition. And that's so that the city can buy land and then either resell it or build housing on it, ideally. There's a lot of things you can do with that, but also you want to capture, when you want to buy land, you want to capture it at a before kind of land speculation happens and then increases the prices of land, so that we can return it over to a nonprofit or resell it, and so that the city either makes money or a nonprofit can build housing on it, also to maintain affordability. In addition, and then lastly, we have density bonus programs, and we have a number of those in different parts of the city. Downtown has one. There's one in the university area. and there's a citywide one as well. And then we've been expanding the use of those. So in Texas, we don't have the ability to do inclusionary zoning. So one way that we try to incentivize developers to create affordable units outside of federal programs, i.e. the LIHTC or the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, is an exchange, right? So a developer wants to create 100 units, and so, but we'd like for 10 of those, 10%, so 10 of them to be affordable. So a developer would agree, yeah, I'll make 10 affordable if you waive or modify building restrictions like height and density be able to build higher, build wider, depending on the lot size, or modify or waive parking or compatibility requirements. So that there's kind of we have to incentivize and kind of do the contractual exchange between the developer and the city in order to kind of create more affordable units. Another option that has happened is that you can also fee in lieu. So there's a set amount of money that we have per unit, and so then you can equate 10 units to be X amount of money, and so a developer could also fee out, provide, pay the amount of money it would have cost to construct 10 units and pay that to the city, and then that money goes into, let's say, the housing trust fund, which now is utilized for rent assistance or utilized for subsidizing other housing somewhere else, or used part of the ROTA program to build housing. So that money is kind of reallocated still within the affordable housing space, but not, it could be used for a number of ways if a developer decides to fee in lieu and it goes back to the city. And so there's different types of programs within the DISI program, but that's a basic kind of definition and how it's kind of used. And other ones are like smart housing and affordability unlocked, which has some of their own requirements, but essentially are density bonus programs at the end of the day. In order to increase affordable units by typical market rate housing developers. And so, but on a broader scale, what are some ways to increase local affordability, right? And so the baseline is that since we don't have enough housing for the amount of folks that are coming into City of Austin, the natural increase internally of folks that live here. We don't have enough units for the amount of folks that we have. So we have a lot of doubling up. You can sometimes have either households with, let's say, 5 people or 6 people in a 2-bedroom, or a family that's got like the centralized family, and then your extended family all living under one roof, because it's so expensive to live in Austin, right? The minimum to buy a home is $400,000 for someone who makes $78,000 a year, maybe. But if you make $50,000 a year, like you would never be able to buy a house, right? And so we really do need to focus on building housing in that 0 to 30% MFI, and also in that 80 to 100, 120% MFI, so that you can start having a much wider range of housing affordability at different price points throughout the city, in order to kind of increase the ability for the city to be affordable for everybody, not just your high earners that can now play in. And so then you end up locking out working class families and people of color, and people that are new straight out of college who are still trying to establish themselves, or growing families. All those needs to be included when we talk about a connected community and a connected city, and one that's going to be really tailored to what kind of city do you want to be? Who do you want to be able to live here? And if you want that sort of diverse, inclusive city, then that's the sort of, you have to kind of you have to really strive to build housing and communities that really accommodate and provide space for everyone to live. So that's kind of my soapbox there. And then another one is prohibit housing choice voucher discrimination. In Texas, private landlords are not required to accept housing vouchers. Exceptions to that are developers who take advantage of like the LIHTC program, or even the city's program through ROTA. Those have requirements for housing vouchers, but otherwise, private landlords in Texas are not required to by state law. And so one way to also increase local affordability, in addition to more vouchers, but also allow for folks to be able to live anywhere, right? So that one helps with folks to be able to live closer to their jobs, and that reduces things like transportation costs and utility costs. And be able to, or like be able to have your kid go to the school that best suits them, right? It also would help prevent concentration of poverty. You end up having landlords who accept vouchers or even affordable housing developments all be localized in one part of the city. And so then you have a concentration of poverty. And so in order to kind of reduce that or mitigate against that, it'd be really helpful if we could change state law to help allow for distribution of housing vouchers citywide. Another way is inclusionary zoning. We don't have rent control or a way to mandate certain like communities to have housing at various price points. And that inclusionary zoning can be on a policy level in a number of different ways, but I think striving towards very inclusionary zoning statewide would be really helpful on a state level. And then changes to our tax system. I personally think that, right, we are property-based tax, but that kind of conflates when you think about, we don't want our property taxes to go up. However, that is the number one source besides sales tax that we generate revenue at the local and the state level. But that also, on the flip side, is what increasing property taxes and wages not increasing at the same rate, forcing folks to be displaced and have to find a city or a community or neighborhood that's for their affordability. So there's kind of that like hug, push and pull. And so by diversifying our state tax system would really help with kind of allowing folks to be able to stay in their homes, and also for the city to be able to fund education and infrastructure and programs, so societal benefit programs, all that are needed to make sure that we are supporting our citizens as best we can as a full society. And then I cannot state this enough, please pay people more money. I, as a housing advocate, wholeheartedly believe that we need to make housing more affordable, but also some of these programs tend to be a Band-Aid. And so until we actually pay people more money, actually living wages, so that people can actually afford to live wherever they want, or even just live where they currently live, we will continue to have the unaffordability problem that we have. And that's all kind of at a public policy level. But that is, and then not really talked enough about. We kind of talk about how to make Band-Aids, but no one's talking about how can you actually just pay people more money so that they can actually afford to live where they are, or choose to live where they want to, and be able to also afford things like healthcare and childcare and transportation costs, all that are included in this kind of constraints that create that like squeeze on a personal budget. So that's actually all I had. And thank you so much for your time. And I hope it was a beneficial presentation and you learned a little bit. So thank you so much for your time.
Kendra, thank you again for taking the time to join us and sharing this critical information about where we are as a community as we look at affordability in our region. And thank you for the amazing work you're doing to realize a more equitable and just society. To our attendees, we are also so glad you have joined us to learn more. Getting informed is the first step on our journey to getting engaged and active in finding opportunities to make progress on affordability. We encourage you to join us for part 2 of this discussion, what is affordable and how do we ensure it stays that way, on September 23rd at 5:30 p.m. We look forward to seeing you there.